Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Joe Swimmer. I'm the Executive Director of the CEEP Network. And on behalf of the CEEP Network and the Episcopal Church's Office of Government Relations, welcome to this digital workshop on gerrymandering and sustaining a healthy, faithful democracy. We're so pleased to have you here with us today and to see the great turnout through the registration that you all have done beforehand. And before we get started, we'd like to have Canon Chuck Robertson, the canon to the presiding bishop for ministry beyond the Episcopal Church, say a couple of words, and then he will introduce our moderator, Alan, and get started with the panel. So Chuck, off to you.
Thanks, Joe. And I am so thankful for the work that the CEEP Network has been doing in this entire past year and a half. You all have really been leading the way and providing incredible webinars and resources for all of us in the church and beyond. So I'm so grateful for this. And this is one more very important one. So to all of you who have chosen to join in today and to participate and attend this time, I think you're in for something very special because we are talking about some very serious and important work. And as we talk about redistricting, as we talk about gerrymandering, this is crucial for us as we move forward as a people together in this country, and certainly for us in the church to be aware of where our role is in all these things. So I am grateful to be here, and I know we are in for quite a wonderful and informative discussion. I am so grateful also that this is being moderated by my dear friend and colleague in the Episcopal Church's Office of Government Relations. So Alan Yarborough, thank you for moderating this discussion with these three remarkable guest panelists, and I leave it to you to take it from here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Canon and Chuck, and thank you, Joe. It's good to be with you all today. I'm the Church Relations Officer for the Office of Government Relations, and help lead our advocacy office's church-facing work, engaging and equipping Episcopalians in advocacy. And we come to this subject today after the Episcopal Church served as an official partner for the 2020 census count, the process which generates the data that is then used for apportionment and redistricting. Because of logistical delays brought about by the pandemic, the Census Bureau just released the first batch of data to the president for the sake of apportionment. And you may have seen the news about which states gained or lost seats in the House of Representatives. And in a few months, states will receive more detailed data that will then allow the redistricting process to continue. And this process is critical to the function of our democracy and ensuring fair representation of the voting public. And there are a lot of misconceptions, I think, around the process of creating districts while avoiding partisan gerrymandering. So we're joined today by three wonderful, knowledgeable speakers who will each teach us about this process, the values that can inform the process, how it plays out from a legal perspective, and how you can get involved in the process yourself, which I'm particularly excited about. So I'll let the three of you introduce yourselves briefly before we'll turn to our first speaker. Simone, you're first in my screen.
Sure thing. Thank you, Alan. My name is Simone Lieber, and I am legal counsel of Redistricting at the Campaign Legal Center, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit that works in a couple of different issue areas, including redistricting, voting rights, campaign finance, and ethics. And we use both advocacy and litigation to, advance democracy.
Great. Thanks for being with us. Heather.
My name is Heather Barta, and I'm a priest in the state of Michigan. And I'm here because I was part of the redistricting effort in Michigan that went to the ballot last year. So excited to talk about that.
Great. Thanks for being with us. And Rebecca, I'll turn to you and let you introduce yourself and carry it away.
Sure. I'm Rebecca Theobald. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. And I have been working on this topic for a number of years. In addition, I'm a member of Grace and St. Stephen's Church in Colorado Springs, and I just completed the Sacred Ground dialogue series. So I'm coming at this from a number of perspectives and delighted to be here today. And I'll start sharing my screen, we hope.
Looks good.
All right. Great. So I am really delighted to be part of this conversation. This is a topic that crosses all types of faith and socioeconomic and ethnic lines. I want to say at the outset that this is really a plea to take up the cause of becoming knowledgeable about redistricting, as well as a call to be active in the process. My goal is to explain and emphasize the influence geospatial technology has had and will have on the drawing of electoral districts at the federal, state, and local levels. We really need to understand the key concepts of this rather unsexy process. The Brennan Center for Justice is an excellent source of information. If you are familiar with this topic of redistricting, you will know that geographic information systems, or GIS, combine location and demographic data in powerful ways, not only for redistricting and voting, but for just about any aspect of how you organize your communities. The opportunity for people who draw maps is that they can manipulate this data, or they can be fair within the constraints of the jurisdiction's criteria. So the educational tools developed through GeoCivics grew out of work in classrooms across Colorado and was piloted in schools throughout the United States. So these resources are appropriate for engaging with the community members, as well as with students in more formal settings. They are intended to provide a starting point for additional discussion. So the first step that you have to take is reviewing data from the census. You want to count everyone once in the right place. We know there were multiple challenges in 2020. There are still concerns about the accuracy of the data, but really the numbers are what we have. We're going to go ahead with those. I encourage you to stay informed about this ongoing discussion. And now that we have the apportionment data, we are looking forward to having the data released later this summer regarding redistricting. So as you're thinking about ways to engage your communities in this conversation, consider taking the census data and exploring the activity that we have created for each state about population shifts to illustrate these numbers. We look at the 15 largest cities in each state over 3 time periods. The dates for each state's activity varies depending on the history of European settlement. Video is available to illuminate how the activity works on the giant map. And this really provides an interactive opportunity for you, your congregation, your students, other members of your community to start this conversation with a similar foundation of knowledge. So you want to kind of think about where your city fits in the history of the state. Does it reflect recent growth? Was it once a crossroads, but now has become less populous due to changing employment opportunities? And you can do this activity with a paper map and small stackable items such as buttons or Legos. So you don't have to have a giant map, but it really is a great focal point if you have access to one. So here's the map everyone was eagerly awaiting a week ago. Remember that apportionment determines how many of the 435 members each state has in the House of Representatives. We usually have this information by December 31st in the year the census was completed, but it was not delivered until Monday, April 26th. Since the first census in 1790, there have been 5 methods of apportionment. The method of equal proportions, was adopted by Congress in 1941 and assigned seats in the House of Representatives according to a priority value. Each of the 50 states is given 1 seat out of the current total of 435. The next, or 51st seat, goes to the state with the highest priority value and continues until all 435 seats have been assigned to a state. There is excellent information and a visualization of this process on the census website. For instance, you can explore a table which explains the number of people per representative, which varies significantly from Wyoming, which of course has 1 representative for 577,719 people, whereas Montana has has a new member of Congress, and each of those members will represent 542,704 people. So it does vary, but if you're really intrigued by the math, there is plenty of data on the census website. So then we have redistricting. This is how we determine which people vote together at any scale. At the federal level, again, it's easy. If you live in Wyoming, you have one House member, but at the state and local scales, you follow similar guidelines. Your districts usually must be contiguous, but usually fewer people will be represented by one person. You will want to know who draws the lines in each instance and what are the rules for drawing them. I want to emphasize that this is one of the most important aspects of this process. If you take nothing else away, I want you to think about what the criteria are in your state for drawing the lines. We really need to understand the redistricting criteria, which starts with equal population, and be transparent about how those criteria are implemented. Draw the Lines PA has created a useful activity to gain a sense of these criteria with interactive flashcards. And this allows participants to review and prioritize and discuss what you think are the most important values when deciding where to draw the lines. Note here in the upper left-hand corner, it says minority representation. And that really refers to the Voting Rights Act, which prohibits barriers at the state and local levels, preventing people from exercising their right to vote, as described in the 15th Amendment. A study out of the Brennan Center found that creation of majority-minority districts does not result in biased maps. Fair maps, however you want to define that, are generally less partisan and also more responsive to minority communities. So you might just be thinking about how competitive is your congressional district or your House or Senate district. Is the same person or type of person elected over and over, or does the representative respond to changes in voter preferences? And it's possible to customize this activity for your community. Thanks to several students here at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs in the Bachelor of Innovation program, we've developed an online version of this activity with the approval of the original authors at Draw the Lines PA. So you can click on this card and get a definition of the criterion. And then you can bring in the process of prioritizing the criteria and taking into consideration your state's requirements. The objective of the activity is to be clear about what guidelines you want to make sure are reflected in the maps that are being drawn. So in this sample, equal population is in the #1 slot and party advantage is in last place. For other people, this might change. The idea is that you would discuss your choices with others, see where there might be conflict. So why would you undertake these activities, getting out a map and thinking about population? So think about a way to invite people, again, your congregation or other congregations with which you might be partnering, and engage people in your community in conversation. The population mapping activity and the flashcards are particularly helpful with groups who have ideas that may be at odds with each other, or with individuals who are not at all familiar with the topic of redistricting. Some states include addressing communities of interest as part of the redistricting criteria. So what constitutes a community of interest has often been difficult to define. There are now some very helpful geospatial technology tools to guide you in this process, including maps and then questions about how you would describe where you live. So you might have multiple perspectives, right? Where you live, work, shop. You might be in a community with a particular watershed, or you might have particular recreation opportunities. The idea is to give some specific details about your concept of community. The darker area in the center of this map represents the area around the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. And my students created this map by contributing their own communities this spring. So you can see that we have the spaces of political geography map, and you can construct a map as an individual or as part of an organization. And this adds the Colorado House district lines. And you can see that the darker part is where many of the students are, and this indicates the university. And this is all contained in one House district in Colorado. So this is not unnecessarily divided. It makes sense. And these kinds of tools give you a sense of how, your sense of space is also governed by the by how we divide up, in this case, state Senate, state House, congressional districts. So moving from kind of background material as we move toward actually drawing districts, we want to consider maps, right, which are at the heart of the redistricting process. We need to analyze the area to incorporate the geography, the history, and other characteristics of the region. Think about whether there are any communities have been divided unnecessarily. And it's also really important to remember that gerrymandering can happen at the state and local as well as the federal level. For instance, there are, school boards also may have zones. That is another, anytime district lines are being drawn, you have the chance for those to either be fair or manipulated in some way. So if you know how to analyze and manage the information, you can create districts that reflect the criteria you want to prioritize. And I would encourage everyone to take a couple hours and try it yourself, because then you will have the confidence to talk about it with others. The good news, you do not have to be a professional cartographer to undertake this task. Everyone can now have access to the data. And GeoCivics provides links to a wide variety of mapping programs, and many of these groups have tutorials available. And again, if you had a space with great internet, you could invite people to come to a socially distanced mapping activity, for instance. Districtor, which is shown here, is one example of an open source online redistricting map program. The instructions lead you through the process. This is available for all states at the congressional and state legislative levels. So I encourage you to add to your knowledge by gaining insight into how your state and community manage redistricting. Think about ways to inspire people to come together and describe and map their communities to avoid having them split. Acknowledge you will not be able to satisfy everyone, but if you are honest and transparent about the process, you will have a better outcome. You will have to prioritize some criteria over others, and you can't have everything you want. You have power as community members to advocate for your community and your congregation. And don't fool yourselves, drawing a map is hard, but it is really worth the effort. So I am here ready to answer questions and to support your work with congregations, elected bodies, and in communities. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. I really appreciate that detailed overview of the tools that you offer and outline of the redistricting process. And I also want to give a shout out to you working for a university. It's Teacher Appreciation Week. So I appreciate you sharing your expertise with us today. And, I want to just highlight how cool it is, I think, that these tools are accessible to us as individuals to just go in, play around with them, think through this process of redistricting and what happens as a way to educate ourselves about what is going on, about what actually takes place in each state. But there are also ways that we go and can engage in that process itself. And these tools, once we're educated about that, can help us do that and be more proactive citizens to participate in this process. So thank you for that deep dive into that, looking at the tools that are available. Really, really appreciate it. So now, Simone, we'll turn to you. We've just heard, of course, from a geographer about this process and these tools to learn about how it works. Your perspective is a little bit different, coming in as legal counsel on redistricting with the Campaign Legal Center. So I'd love to hear about your work in litigation on this topic, what dynamics we should pay attention to in the redistricting process that might be lost when the issue is oversimplified.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and share a presentation as well that sort of digs into some of the particulars about the things that Rebecca just shared. And hopefully that's working for everyone there. I'm going to specifically talk about communities of interest and separately the Voting Rights Act. Communities of interest is a difficult term. It does not have a specific definition that is uniform across the 50 states, and even within each individual state, there's going to be varying definitions there. So let's dig into that a little bit. A good place to start for defining what a community of interest to you is sort of along the lines of what Rebecca was saying earlier, what a community means to you particularly, and what ties you to your community specifically. What would you say are your predominant interests? What are your predominant experiences? And I'm just going to look at 2 specific states and how they define communities of interest. One thing to note is that not every state includes communities of interest in the redistricting criteria, and that's something you'll want to look into, as well as looking into who is doing the redistricting in your state, because when you're doing the kind of advocacy that Rebecca talked about and that I'll talk about a little bit, you want to make sure you're directing it to the right person. And on the note of approaching this as, you know, somebody who's engaged in litigation and representing local communities, that's going to be different even depending on what kind of race you're advocating for. So in some states, the map drawers for congressional districts are different than the map drawers for state legislative districts. And then obviously map drawing at the local level is done generally at the local level. And right now, the 2 cases that we're engaged in are actually for a city council race and a county commission race. And those are making a big difference in representation for our clients. So there really is like no too granular place for you to be doing this advocacy and defining your community of interest. So Michigan has this definition for communities of interest, and I'll focus in on 2 particular aspects of it. First is that a community of interest will share cultural or historical characteristics or economic interests. And that's pretty broad as it seems to be there. That could cover a lot of ground. And specifically in Michigan, communities of interest does not include relationships with political parties, incumbents, or political candidates. And I think the aim of this in Michigan is to prevent a community of interest from being a stand-in for partisan gerrymandering. So that's one thing that's actually a little bit different than in California, where in California, you have the definition for community of interest focusing on an identifiable set of people who have a common set of experience or interests that also inhabit a close geographic area. And that tends to mirror the Michigan definition pretty closely. But there is a little bit of a difference where in California, they say that a clear indication that a community is a community of interest is its proven record of working effectively in the political arena. And that can be advocating for specific policies or advocating for specific candidates. So if you work together previously on advocating for specific policies with a different community, you might form a community of interest. Now in California, the maps are drawn by a commission, an independent redistricting commission. And I'm going to provide a few examples here of what that commission considered to be communities of interest after they came out with their map. And this is just to provide an example of what you might consider to be your own kind of community of interest. One is Latino and Asian American communities, and they were linked by social and economic interests, lower income status, and recent immigration. I really like this example because it shows that you can have 2 communities that are, you know, ethnic communities. That's one example of a community of interest. But the things that link them aren't limited to one thing or their status as a minority. It's things that derive from that, like recent immigration or lower income status, if maybe they've had less of an opportunity to establish themselves economically. So that's something that shows that if you have a community of interest, you shouldn't necessarily just be looking for one connection with the different individuals, but actually be looking for multiple connections. Now, obviously, those are ethnic communities that are linked together. And that's the kind of thing that could lead to like a Voting Rights Act suit if they weren't represented. There's also communities of interest that I wouldn't have necessarily thought of, like groups that live along a national forest. And so they have a common interest in wildlife and emergency services because of the danger of wildfires. There's other communities that were linked together because of fishing, environmental concerns, timber and recreational opportunities. And that was defined by actually a highway corridor. So this just shows that in California, where they're operating under one definition of communities of interest, you can have a whole range of different kinds of communities that were linked together because of their common interest. So why should you bother submitting communities of interest testimony? And this is written testimony where you would advocate for why your group should be put together, or map testimony using any of the tools that Rebecca described, you know, actually presenting a model map. Obviously, the first goal is that you can advocate for your community to be linked together, and that you will, in the first instance of map drawing, have your community be put in one district so that you can advocate effectively. But I'm from Florida, where the map drawers don't always necessarily listen to the community. And so I know that sometimes it might seem a little bit pointless or fruitless to go ahead and do this kind of advocacy. But I want to tell you that it's definitely still worthwhile. And that's because even if the advocacy doesn't work and you're not drawn together in the first instance, you could then use that testimony as evidence in a later suit. And so that's sort of where, Campaign Legal Center comes in, and say that community earlier, we talked about like the Latino and Asian communities that were linked together. If they were not drawn into one district, we could potentially bring a Voting Rights Act suit. And one piece of evidence that they're a cohesive community that would be used in that lawsuit would be that the communities came together to advocate to be put into one district together. And so that's why it's very helpful to include this information, even if you don't necessarily think it's going to be listened to. And as I said earlier, it's important to do this, know who you should be advocating to based on what maps you're advocating for, and do it at all levels, from the congressional, state legislative, all the way down, like Rebecca said, to school board, because those lines really matter too. This might be a little bit of a flippant image, but I do sort of want to bring this up, which is to stay in your lane when you're doing this advocacy. And that's not to say that you only have to advocate for a community that you're a part of. For example, I'm a Latina, but if I was to be in a cohesive community, if I think I'm aligned with that Asian community that we talked about, I wouldn't just want to say that. I would want to go ahead and talk to that community and make sure that I understood their interests and that I was right in my perception that we actually have interests that are aligned. You don't want to speak for other communities because it can go badly. And I do want to give one example of this from California. The reason that so many of these are from California is they actually have the best record. So that's why we're talking a lot about that. But in California, the last time map drawing went around, some well-meaning map drawers linked together two Native communities, and they were previously in separate districts. And the map drawer said, well, these people have common interests. They're both Native communities. We're going to go ahead and put them in one district. Well, when the proposed map was made public, the two Native communities showed up in force and said, we don't want to be in the same district with one another at all, because the thing that predominated, their predominating interest, was not the fact that they were both Native communities. There were other interests that led to them actually wanting to be in the separate districts that they were already in. And so that's just a bit of a cautionary tale, that you want to be sure you're talking to the relevant people and you're making connections with communities. So if you think that you might be in a community of interest with someone, or if you're drawing a map that impacts a different community of interest, you want to be sure that you're getting it right. Switching directions a little bit to talk about the Voting Rights Act. As Rebecca mentioned, the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, and they were trying to outlaw, and it did outlaw, a lot of racially discriminatory voting practices, such as poll taxes and literacy tests and all sorts of things. And in 1982, Congress actually passed some amendments to the VRA that made it so that you don't have to prove racially discriminatory intent in these practices, but that you just have to prove a racially discriminatory impact. And that made a really big difference as far as litigation was concerned. In 1986, the Supreme Court, in a famous case, ruled that if there is a sufficiently large and geographically compact minority community, then a single member district must be drawn for that community. So they have to be put in a community with a large enough minority community that they can elect their candidate of choice. And this has made a huge difference for minority communities across the country. This is a graph that shows the increase in state house seats held by minority legislators. Now, it's worth noting that not all minority preferred candidates are actually minorities themselves. They might not be a part of the group, but oftentimes they are. And so this is a good sign to show that Jingles has made a difference in allowing minority representation. But that always doesn't look how we think it does. So I don't know if anyone has seen this before. It's a famous map. We call it the earmuffs. And it looks like a textbook gerrymander in like a bad way, right? Like we think of these, if you've seen the gerrymander salamander, it's winding and it has bad connections. And if you look over at this one, the connecting line on the left side is pretty much just a highway. And I would look at this, if I didn't know any better, and think, well, this is a bad gerrymander. This can't be good. They're trying to, do something bad here. But this district was actually created after a Section 2 Voting Rights Act suit to allow the Latino community in Chicago to elect their candidate of choice. And this map is actually connecting two Latino communities that are both concentrated. But if you were to draw directly through in a way that looked compact, they wouldn't be able to elect their candidate of choice. So this is just a cautionary tale. If you are working with current maps right now and you're looking to redraw them, if you want to be doing a sample map, don't necessarily just think that a bad shape is a bad map, but you want to look into it further and see exactly what's happening there, because it might actually be something good. that is it for the presentation that I have for you guys. If you have any more questions, obviously we're going to have a Q&A, or you can email us. And then I do want to put a quick plug in, I guess, for our Democracy U Toolkit at Campaign Legal Center's website. It has a lot of really great resources for redistricting things and also for other democracy matters. And so it's a good place for you to start. That is all from me.
Thank you, Simone. Yeah, I appreciate that. And, you know, what I hear in that, and I hope that it's somewhat apparent for our audience, you know, you talk a lot about the need to really know and be familiar with the communities, and that can help those the relationships that are built through strong communities can help inform this process in an effective way. And so that's one reason why, you know, I think the Episcopal Church and other faith communities can hopefully serve this process well, and be a great conduit through which these conversations can take place. You know, and part of what I heard as well from Rebecca and from you is the reality that this process is unique to each state. So we've got to be local and specific to our approach, and also an emphasis on the consideration of values. You know, we talk a lot in our advocacy about values, and that our political differences often are less about having opposing values, just things that are opposite of each other. And they're more about how we emphasize the values that we care about. An example I like to use in our civil discourse programming is with the church outreach committee, you know, that has a limited budget, and how do they determine, you know, what to support. And if they decide this year we're not giving anything to the homeless ministry, we're going to put all of our funds to the community garden, I don't think that implies that they suddenly don't care about homeless people. But you've got to make a decision, you know, weighing these values against each other. And that same process is I think, apparent in what you all are describing. And so now I'm excited to turn it over to Reverend Heather, who served on a redistricting commission and was a part of bringing, you know, these values into this work. You know, through the 2020 election season, we spoke with many Episcopalians who have served as poll workers. I was a poll worker myself for the first time. But getting involved in the redistricting process seems like another level of engagement entirely, which is amazing. So I'd love to hear, Heather, from your experience doing that in Michigan, and hopefully you can inspire others to do the same.
Thank you. I am honored to be here. I am Heather Barta, a priest in the Diocese of Eastern Michigan. And so I'd like to share briefly my story of involvement with the redistricting process. I think that even though mine will be specific to Michigan, hopefully it will be inspirational to wherever you are. In 2017, I worked with the group called Voters Not Politicians. This group was formed by a woman who is tired of gerrymandering in Michigan. I thought it was gracious that Simone said, if you see a bad map, that it may not be bad. That was not the case in Michigan for pretty much any of our maps. So there was a woman who suddenly declared on Facebook, I want to fix gerrymandering. I want to fix the redistricting process in Michigan. And so for Michigan, it had been a process, that whole redistricting thing had been a process that benefited the politicians and not the people who lived in the state. Hence our name, Voters, Not Politicians. So this group ran a citizen-led ballot initiative. The main group worked with the Board of State Canvassers to craft wording for the petitions and had to go through that whole process and make sure everything looked correct and was going to be accepted once we collected the signatures. And because we were voter-led, because we were volunteer, people kept telling us, well, it can't possibly work. This isn't going to work. Why would you even try? There's no way that you can change this. We were asking for a constitutional change, and the people who held power just couldn't believe that we could ever do it. But this story is so great. So I learned about this opportunity and I volunteered. My husband and I both volunteered with them. I am very gifted in organization, so I volunteered to be a team captain in my area. So my job was to do all of the organizing, be in touch with volunteers, get them the supplies, train people about how to make sure they were filling in the forms correctly, since every county needed a different petition. I would organize groups to be at area festivals and events, and then I'd collect all the petitions to take back to the headquarters. So across the state, we were working on collecting signatures, and it was an all volunteer team. Again, they told us we couldn't possibly do it, not as volunteers and not as rookies, but we did. Oh, the day we delivered 425,000 signatures, There were so many tears. There was so much celebration. We got on the ballot. And of course, that 425 was way more than we needed, because we had to plan for that some of them would be taken off and disqualified because it was the wrong signature for the wrong county, or something didn't work. It wasn't a registered voter. So it was just such a great day of celebration to turn in boxes and boxes of petitions. So of course, once that happened, that only led to more work of knocking on doors and encouraging people to vote yes on proposal 2. And I have to say, the people who came around, so I talked about me being gifted in organizing, and I'm a huge extrovert, but even the introverts around us, my husband, huge introvert, he was willing, he so believed in this cause, he was willing to talk to people to get the signature on the petition. He was willing to talk to people and encourage them to vote yes on proposal 2. And November 6th, proposal 2 passed in Michigan. Huge celebration, lots of tears. I share my specific story today only to encourage you that there are things that you can do. So each state's rules are different. I don't know where you live or what the particular mechanisms are for how redistricting works for you. Not every state can pass a proposal to change the state's constitution. Different places will have different rules, but there are always ways to be engaged and involved in the process in your area. Rebecca is a great resource for this. She knows what's going on across the country. And I was inspired by something that she has said. If you're in a faith organization, this is where your values come to the fore. I think sometimes people might think, oh, separation of church and state, or we can't possibly talk about that because that's a political issue and we're the church. But throughout my participation in Michigan, and as I'm aware of what's going on across the country, I want to remind us of part of our baptismal covenant. Will you respect the dignity of every human being? When we can hold on to that, this is an area where we can show that we value each person's voice and vote. If there are people out there who feel unheard because of districting practices, that is in direct violation of our baptismal covenant. That is something as Christians, as Episcopalians, that we can speak to. So as Christians, we also value community. Our work is to expand relationships, to grow relationships and community, and to look outside of our natural circles of people who look like us or talk like us or vote like us, right? So as we start building those communities, as we meet and interact with more people, we can build new communities, which makes us stronger as Christians and as people in this country, as world citizens. Building communities leads to conversations. So the more that we have these conversations with people who are different than our normal circles, the more that we can start to see how that can lead to a conversation around communities of interest. Right? Simone and Rebecca both talked about this. And I think that it's really important to start talking about these things. It is one of the things that Michigan is looking at right now as we start the redistricting conversation, but important for where you are. Who are the communities of interest around you? How are you building up community and conversation between those? And it's also important to then understand the implications. And then for us in the Episcopal Church, the racial justice implications. So it's helpful to know not about just our own interests, but to work with other communities of interest around you. I think Simone had a great warning to us not to speak for others, but I want to encourage us that there may be a way that we can continue to invite others into conversation. And if we have some power in the system, that we might be able to say, hey, you know, I know this other community of interest, and I think it'd be really good to hear from them also. So again, that respecting the dignity of every human being, living into our baptismal covenant, continuing to build community and relationship so that everybody can be involved. So I encourage you, to engage in your community, the neighborhood, the city, the surrounding towns. So in this particular case, you have a voice. And the question now is, how do districts get drawn where you live? So why should we do this? why should we do this? These are the questions that I leave you with. Why should we do this? Because being involved in our communities is part of our call as a Christian. Building up relationships, building communities is part of what we're called to do to spread God's love. So the questions you can ask as you go forth: how are districts drawn from your local to your federal level? Whose voice isn't being heard? How can you use your power in the system to affect change and fairness? Hopefully through all of this today, you are inspired to find what the process is where you live and to start speaking to fair representation.
Thank you, Heather, for sharing that and talking about your engagement, you know, what that was like for you, why you were motivated to do that, and tying it to our faith, our Episcopal traditions. So now just open up for questions. We've got several coming in. And I'll try to get to, we'll get to as many as we can coming through. I see that Bobby sent in a question. They live in Alabama, where the state legislature is in charge of drawing the district. Can you walk us through the process of gaining influence over this process? Rebecca, I see you're going to connect with them afterwards, but I wonder if you could speak to that on the webinar today.
Right. So the very first thing you want to do is learn about your own state, and then you'll have a sense of what the rules are. And Simone, you probably have a better sense of what the challenges are in each state, but in places that are lacking public opportunities for conversation. I mean, there are states that run the gamut from a place like Michigan or Colorado, which as part of its independent redistricting process includes plans for public comment. Then there are states where the legislature continues to draw the lines, but they have public comment opportunities. And then there are states with no public comment. So in that case, you are left talking to your representative and saying, this is what I think should be done, or this is what I think is unfair, and having those conversations simply as you would with any other topic.
Just to build on that, in terms of places where there is an opportunity for public comment, if there's not any hearings or they're accepting, written submissions or things like that, that doesn't mean that you can't still make a written submission, which is just to say that you can get together your community of interest and write a letter, and an open letter to your legislatures and in the committee that is drawing those maps. And that's a way of getting that on the public record so that you can do the private advocacy with your legislators, like Rebecca said, but you can also help it get it in the public record so that it can be helpful for any subsequent litigation that might be necessary.
Great, and I know this isn't quite fully asked in the chat, but someone did ask, when are most lines going to be redrawn? And I know that the timelines are going to vary for each state to an extent, and of course, given that the census data is 3 to 4 months late, that it's disrupting that process. So I'm wondering if you all could, someone could speak to your sense of where that is, and what the timing of when folks should be paying attention to these steps.
I just want to hop in right now. Michigan is right now. Our redistricting is starting soon. We're starting to train people in how to draw your map of your community of interest so that you can submit it. There'll be open conversation throughout the summer.
And there is a difference between drawing your community of interest and saying, this is what my community of interest is, and this is how I think you should treat it, and drawing an actual congressional or legislative map as a practice process. I mean, there are going to be opportunities in a variety of states, and they have particular mapping software that they would like you to use to submit a map that you think is the best map. And if that's a process that you want to undertake, I highly encourage you to do that. And through that process, then you will really understand what the challenges are of constructing districts in your state. And you can do this with the existing data. And the great blessing that we have in 2021 that we did not have in 2011 are these open source software tools, which have been created by universities and just kind of as similar to the woman in Michigan, Dave, who created Dave's Redistricting app. He just felt that it was really important for people to have access to this information. And so I would encourage you to go out and use those tools that are available. So for instance, today also, I would say this is an ongoing activity. And if this is something that you're interested in, figure out in your state who is providing that information and make sure you're paying attention, because what we say today could change tomorrow. And so in Colorado, they are looking at a bill that will say, all right, we're going to go ahead and start trying to figure out how to draw these lines with the latest data that we have from the demographics office. It's not the official census data. We won't be able to finish drawing the lines until that data is in, but we're going to start. And that's a perfectly reasonable process to do, because in Colorado, for instance, we're trying to figure out how to, we're adding an 8th district, and we're trying to figure out how all of these different counties and municipalities are going to be connected, and all of these communities. And you can draw those in very different ways. And so don't be dissuaded by somebody who says, oh, we just really need to wait for the census data, or we don't have, all the ducks aren't in a row. Get some experience in drawing the map. And then that way you'll be able to better understand the challenges that come along when the actual census data are delivered and available.
And I'm seeing a couple of questions, which I might actually be the best to respond to. How can faith-based communities, get more involved? How are we engaging the Episcopal Church on this? In part, at least from the Office of Government Relations perspective, our task is to advocate to the U.S. federal government. We really don't get as involved in states. But that said, some of the practices and approaches to advocacy are applicable at any level and across issues, just like with redistricting. So this webinar is a part of hopefully raising the profile of this process. It's a continuation, as I mentioned, of our 2020 census engagement. And so we will, in addition to having this broadcast live now, be sharing it afterwards. We're already in touch with the National Association of Episcopal Schools to hopefully get this webinar and the resources that the three panelists have provided today into the hands of teachers at schools. And we'll certainly be engaging in conversations as the months move on this year. So I, would encourage folks to take these resources, have a church forum around them, do it, multi-generational forums as well. I think these tools are things that, they're applied in academic settings for grade schools, for universities, but I mean, they're there for all of us. And I think everyone can be learning from them. So that would be my, advice. What can you do in your parish? Just start that conversation there. Be the person that takes the energy and information that our speakers are sharing into your parish and organize something around it there. Glancing now farther down the questions, and if the panelists have seen a question already that they would like to respond to, please let me know. So someone is asking, should I talk to my state representative to find out what groups might be available to work on these issues? So maybe reframing, how do you engage with the state legislature in particular on redistricting?
And I would reemphasize how important the state legislature is as well. And Simone, maybe you can speak to this, and there's a question about Georgia that you might want to address, but the state legislature can also be gerrymandered, just as the congressional districts can. So it might behoove you, if you want to get engaged with this, is to kind of divide and conquer. And I don't know if Heather wants to speak to how they are addressing these different concerns in Michigan as well.
It's just part of their piece that they have to redraw the lines for state house and state senate, and also US House. So they have a big job ahead of them. So they don't get the little local pieces. So I mean, those pieces you'll have to track down.
Yeah, and with regard to Georgia specifically, I think that's sort of one of the cases I was talking about earlier, where again, I think it's worth making your voice heard in this process, even if ultimately it won't impact the maps that are drawn in the first instance, because that's when litigation comes to play. Yeah. There was a very specific question about the status of the Michigan litigation, and I will just say, yeah, that case is Don B. Benson. It's actually handled by CLC, our organization, and the Sixth Circuit actually just heard arguments on that case on March 17th, and so we are just waiting to get a decision from the court. The defendants are essentially making, or the plaintiffs are essentially making, I'm so used to being the plaintiff, but the plaintiffs in that case are making the same argument essentially to this court that they made a year ago. And it was not successful a year ago, and we do not think that it will be successful in this instance. We hope.
And I would encourage everyone to listen to how redistricting is being reported at the local, state, and national level. And frankly, I've been disheartened by, again, how political it must be. And I salute the reporters who are covering this, but I would really like to hear at the end of every report about redistricting as to whether there is a question about how fair the maps are that are being drawn. Because right now the conversation says, where are we going to put that 8th district in Colorado? Or who are we going to draw out of their district in Pennsylvania? And I have a very strong reaction to saying that's not the conversation we want to have. We want to say, how can a fair map be drawn? It could be that there will be 2 individuals of the same party in a district, and they would be pitted against each other. But I would like, particularly from a faith-based perspective, to say, how can we have a different tenor about this conversation?
Yeah, I appreciate you raising that, Rebecca. Simone, I see you unmuted.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, if we're moving on, I saw another question that was asking specifically about what you can do to promote an independent redistricting commission in your state, if you're in a state right now that doesn't currently have one. And I think I would hark back to what Heather said, right? Like that started in Michigan because one person saw a problem and wanted to fix it. And you could be that person, or your community could be that community. And it starts at the grassroots, and it starts with that effort. So you could look into, what it takes to make a petition in your state, what it takes to get something on the ballot, and figuring out what kind of, signature number you have. That's going to need to be a really organized effort. That's going to take a lot of effort. But why not try? I will say that if you're going to be developing that kind of a commission, you want to make sure that you're developing something that's actually going to work. And so you want to look into what's been done in previous states that's worked, what's not worked. I know that CLC has a resource guide for making sure that if you make an independent redistricting commission, you put in fail-safes to ensure that the process that's conducted is transparent, and that there are ethics requirements on the independent redistricting commissioners to make sure that they also are going to be, non-biased people who have the same kind of limitations that legislators have about accepting donations or, things that might make them biased. So there's a lot to consider, but if you're considering it, there's like no time like the present to go ahead and take that action.
Great. So Nancy asked, could a fair map be drawn by a computer program to take politics out of it? I think it's a reasonable question. And, my mind is, that seems like it could be simple, but then I'm also wondering, what values are we telling the computer program to emphasize? That's kind of where my mind's going. But I wonder if you all have heard anything of this. Has this been attempted before?
Yeah, it's pretty difficult. I think this is one of those things where I'm not sure that computers are going to be able to replace people. I saw another question earlier about why can't all the maps be like Iowa, where they're all simple little squares, it looks so pretty. Why don't we just do that? And I think for me, it goes back to the earmuffs district. A computer might not necessarily draw that. It took people to understand their communities and know that these two communities that were geographically separate had common interests and needed to be together to elect their candidate of choice. That being said, maybe the program exists, but like Alan said, what are you inputting into that program? What biases that the coders of the program are making are going to be imported as well.
I have been really heartened over the past several years working with groups, lawyers like Simone, and also political scientists, mathematicians, and computer programmers who are all thinking about these questions from so many different directions. If you're interested in looking at some of the research that's been done from a more mathematical perspective, the group Metric Geometry and Gerrymandering group out of Tufts University, excellent questions about this. And so what I find really heartening about the discussions around redistricting are that people are really coming at it with a good faith conversation, right? How can we make this better? I'm a mathematician, let me bring in my tools to see if the map that has been created is outside of the norm, right? I'm a geographer, and so I want to remind people that they need to look at the physical features. You might have a squiggly line, but that might be because that's a river, right? So that would make sense. So you have to bring all of these perspectives to bear. And I think that, again, like a church, you have a need for many different viewpoints.
Heather, to kind of reframe this question your way, how do you see the church helping with that, helping to facilitate this relationship building? That's maybe a more fundamental question across the board, but applicable here to this process.
Well, because one of my themes really is community, right? So how do we continue to just keep inviting people into conversations? I will always talk about going to the edge, right? Going to the edge of what we already know to see what's going on over there, right? With those others where God already is and God is already working. And so I just think that it helps have that conversation. If we don't, the church can be the place where we don't draw those lines, right? To use a voters not politician tagline of draw the line. It can be a place of deeper conversation, of exploration into learning more about people that we haven't met before. There's that great sign. I quoted it earlier today. I wish I could remember all of it, but love your neighbor who doesn't look like you or speak like you or pray like you or vote like you. And I think that points to this a lot of how are we going to continue to be the voice that just says, not that we have an agenda at the end. It's not about saying, well, we're going to be part of this so that we can draw our own line so that, St. Swithins of the Swamp Episcopal Church make sure they have their area of their community of interest scaled together, drawn together at the end, but really to just facilitate that conversation of getting to know one another. And then we can learn to have different lines than we may have drawn.
Any final comments from any of the three of you before I close?
I will just really quickly say, as someone who is coming into this as a bit of an outsider, I think it's amazing, especially when faith groups engage in this kind of work. And I'm somebody who grew up in a church and, still is a part of one. And it's really heartening to me to see everyone engaging in this and the high interest in it. And taking off my professional hat for a second, I just want to say that I really do find this to be something special.
And just a thought going forward, these are kind of the easy discussions, right? I've said that the redistricting community, from all of these perspectives, everybody's coming together. Let's have fair maps. At some point, we're going to have some disagreements, right? And so it might behoove the church then to think about how we can talk about those concerns. And again, that's why I would say where you really want to put your emphasis initially as a church is having a conversation about those criteria and what those mean on the ground. So that's really, I think, an opportunity for faith organizations to take that forward.
Well, and I appreciate being here. And I'll just say that if you're looking for a way to have a conversation, the Office of Government Relations has a civil discourse curriculum. I highly recommend it.
Thank you for plugging that. I appreciate it. Yeah, we do. Our civil discourse curriculum is available online. Individuals can work through it. You can work through it as a group. It was a partnership created in partnership with Church Next, a ministry of forward movement. I also am available to work with church groups to go through the curriculum as well. I just finished with the Society for the Companions of the Holy Cross, Diocese of San Joaquin, and the Diocese of San Joaquin Clergy Conference. I'll work with both the Diocese of San Joaquin and the Diocese of Arizona coming up in the next few months. So thank you all. Thanks to the CEEP Network for co-hosting this with us. Heather, Rebecca, Simone, thank you for sharing your expertise here. We'll hopefully gather resources in an email and a recording to send out to those who registered, and we'll certainly promote on our social media as well. So thanks to everyone for tuning in. And the last thing to say today is may the 4th be with you.